Good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing? Good, great. Well, we're going to be a little bit more energetic in this presentation because it's going to involve some interaction with all of y'all. Welcome to Tips from the Pros. My name is Ethan Hawes, so thank you for coming to my presentation. I know you guys have a lot of options, and I do appreciate that. I do want to open with a story, and I want to paint a picture in your mind right now. So once upon a time, I was a simmer that was disorganized. It always seemed like I was behind the ball. Everything always seemed rushed, and I was never really sure where I or the aircraft, for that matter, was going. Many times I'd end up crashing, I'd end up in the grass, making ATC really upset, and not sure what I was doing because I'd be frustrated with myself and sharing choice words with my computers. So show of hands, how many of y'all have been in this situation before? Okay, so everyone pretty much. How many of y'all are currently still here in this situation? Great. Well, either way, it doesn't matter because all of y'all are in the right place. Today, we're going to be hitting on the subjects of effective cockpit organization. Also with that, including briefings and the roles that they play. Also, we're going to be talking about automation management techniques. So why should you listen to me? I started simulating back in 2006. That's actually a picture of me when I had a lot more hair. Over a decade and degree later, though, I ended up turning what I thought was a really fun hobby and that I really enjoyed doing into a way to pay the bills. Currently, I'm flying for Republic Airways on the 170 and the 175 out of Houston, Texas. And I'm going to be upgrading to captain here towards the end of summer. So really excited about that. I'm really thankful, though, for the simulation community and what they've been able to provide me and offer me. As you're here at Flight Sim Expo in Orlando this year, and you're browsing the booths and talking to other people, keep in mind the power of the Flight Sim community. It truly is a beautiful thing. We have so many people from different walks of life, different areas around the world. Not to mention that, but it's also a great place to network and create lifelong friends. Also keep in mind we have a lot of young people in this hobby, so there's a lot of chances to help mentor and provide these younger people with great leadership skills, great role model skills, and all that stuff. So let's dive into what we're going to be talking about today. Not only are you going to learn how the professionals fly, but how we implement daily techniques, which I mentioned before, on the job in the cockpit to use to make decisions and fly the aircraft in your own home simulators. Also, it's going to make your simulator experience more enjoyable and more fulfilling. Let's talk about the problem really quick. So flying can just be dang confusing at times. I get it. A lot of simmers just don't have real-world training. It's pretty expensive, as we all know. You got to sell your arm, your kidney, and your left leg. A lot of simmers lack experience and skills, and these super complex aircraft that we have out today are just confusing as well. Real-world pilots typically spend a month to 2 months just learning the airplane and how to fly it. So you're already kind of at a disadvantage there as well. A lot of simmers aren't organized, or they just don't have the right thought process in place to excel in these really complex aircraft or these complex airspaces. So let's dive into the solution. Believe it or not, the solution is very simple. And that's to fly like American hero and world-renowned aviator Denzel Washington from the movie Flight. Y'all have seen Flight, right? Great movie. If you haven't, check it out when you go home. Great movie for the airplane. So, in reality though, many of the solutions to these problems isn't necessarily exercising, looking cool in your uniform or anything like that. It starts with good cockpit organization. So one key thing to keep in mind is consistency is key in aviation. A major component of not only being able to operate the aircraft successfully, but also having a successful game plan and to consistently execute that successful game plan relies in cockpit organization. What are some ways that you guys execute cockpit organization at home? I need a couple examples that y'all use at home. Anyone? Go ahead. Label my switches. You label your switches. That's great. There's nothing worse than hitting the wrong switch. Go ahead.
A dedicated place to sim.
Yeah, a dedicated place to sim. Given your significant other, if you have one, you may be limited in that regard. Go ahead.
Having a dedicated place to keep your charts.
A dedicated place to keep your charts. That's actually one of the things that we're going to talk about here in a bit. So those are all really good examples. We'll start with flying roles, though. Pilot flying and pilot monitoring are the two divided duties that we execute on the flight deck on a daily basis. These are the major pillars of cockpit organization that we use on our job every single day. Pilot flying is solely responsible for flying the aircraft, and that is it. Also, they're going to be listening to the radios, but ultimately they're flying, hence the name pilot flying. Pilot monitoring is actively monitoring the aircraft and mentally flying. So when we're looking and we're pilot monitoring and we're watching the pilot flying do his stuff, we're also mentally flying along with the aircraft. We're also going to assist the pilot flying in any flying related duties. The objective is to make their life simpler so they can enjoy their coffee, sit back and relax, and you have to earn every single penny of that paycheck. Also managing and monitoring any aircraft systems, that's typically the pilot monitoring's duties, and also conducting all the radio communications. So those are your big points there for pilot monitoring. Key rule of thumb though is if the autopilot is off, the pilot flying is solely flying the aircraft. He's not working in the FMC, he's not making any automation changes or anything like that, dialing any new altitudes, headings, speeds, anything like that. He's calling for all this. I often get asked at the airlines, are we allowed to hand fly? Yes, we are. However, it's always a workload dependent task. So if you see that your teammate is struggling, we're going to be using automation to make their lives and our lives a little bit easier and keep a safe atmosphere in the cockpit, because safety is key in aviation. Now that we know what flying roles consist of, let's talk about them in action. So this is actually a really good example of pilot flying and monitoring skills being demonstrated. In this example, we're at cruise flight with automation engaged. And if you look, the pilot flying, so the captain in this case, is actively monitoring the automation and the guidance panel and also monitoring the PFD. And we'll talk about the FMA and all this stuff in a little bit. The pilot monitoring is actively following along with that flight. So he's looking down, he's taking everything in, he's ensuring that the pilot flying is inputting the correct inputs and trying to catch any mistakes that the pilot flying may make. He's also assisting when needed, it looks like, and he's actively working the radios, and it looks like he already got landing data information for the landing airport, so speeds, parking gate, weather, all that fun stuff. So they're still at cruise altitude, and he's knocked all this out already. Let's take a look at some bad examples of flight crew roles being executed. Actually, though, this is a really bad example of flight crew roles being executed. Who's actually flying the airplane in this picture? I'm looking and no one's looking out front, no one's looking at the flight instruments, none of that is going on. So the real challenge that we all simmers see in the simulator world is that it's almost impossible to divide the duties of a flight crew unless you're using an add-on like FS2 crew or any of the shared cockpit add-ons that exist out there. Also, most transport category aircraft are designed to be flown by a team. So the fact that you're flying by yourself, you're automatically at a disadvantage. However, not all hope is lost, Obi-Wan. We're still in luck. So if we keep the cockpit organized and collected, even flying single pilot is possible. Another tool that we use to ensure cockpit organization is mental mindset. So staying ahead of the airplane. How many of y'all have heard this expression before? Show of hands. Okay, so a decent amount. Beautiful. So believe it or not, professional pilots and chess players actually, well, any pilot and a chess player have a lot in common. Chess players are trying to be essentially ahead of their opponent by 3 moves. So they're always thinking ahead while still maintaining a mental presence in the current state of the game. Or in a pilot's case, the airplane, they're thinking ahead of the airplane. Mentally thinking, believe it or not, is one of the most fatiguing aspects, I would say, of being a professional pilot and operating on a day-to-day basis. A good example of that is if I go and do a single day trip with an out and back from my base, I was only scheduled to fly 4 total hours on that one day that I was flying. Well, unfortunately, due to weather, bad rides, we ended up going to holding and diverting to an alternate, and then having to go to that original destination airport and come back. There was a lot of mental disturbances and things to think about and process in that relatively short day. Well, the short day ended up coming out to about 6 hours, which is still not bad for a work day. Not your typical 8-hour average Monday through Friday work day. However, I was completely drained by the time I got home, only after working 6 hours. So let's put the forward-thinking aspect into a little bit of action here using this flight profile. So as I mentioned, we tried to think 3 steps ahead of the airplane. It's worth noting, though, that thinking, planning, and strategizing can most effectively be done while you're still on the ground at the gate. That's where a majority of your best work is done, believe it or not. Because once the aircraft starts moving, it's a little bit harder to process things in the future. Try to get in the habit of asking yourself, though, before you leave that gate, or any time throughout flight, what's next? What's going on? Are there any possible threats? Are there any things different than my last flight or every other flight I've done in the thousands of hours I've flown in the sim? And if we have those problems or those threats, how can we mitigate them? What can we do to prevent them from happening, or how can we lessen the effects of them? That's what I'm talking about when we're thinking 3 steps ahead and trying to mitigate our thinking a little bit. So an example that we're going to run through here is we're sitting at the gate on the far left side there in the pre-flight phase, the parked phase. Some things that I'm thinking ahead of as a professional pilot is we're sitting at the gate and it looks like we have hot temperatures. So automatically what comes to my mind is reduced takeoff performance. Are we going to be able to take off with the amount of runway that's available and the weight that we're carrying? Another thing that I'm kind of looking at is it looks like there's mountains in the area. So it's a mountainous terrain airport. Are there any different departures, procedures, or obstacle departure procedures that we're going to be utilizing? Are there any special engine out procedures or any special company procedures? It's probably a good idea to have your terrain up on your primary flight, or sorry, your MFD. So it's way better just to have that up and have that situational awareness there. Also, it looks like at cruise it's a little bumpy, so we probably want to think about if we're going to let our virtual flight attendants go serve their virtual drinks and cookies, that we may want to ask them to remain seated so we get a better idea if the ride's smooth out or not. Also, it looks like at our destination, we're not having too good of weather. So do we require an alternate? If you guys went to the dispatcher presentation by Matt Bartles yesterday in the other room, he talked about when we need an alternate and how we select one and all that fun stuff. So do we need an alternate? Do we have enough gas? Are they holding? Do we have enough gas to hold? Or are they going to put us in a hold and we're just going to have to divert anyways because we don't have enough gas? These are all things I'm thinking about before we leave the gate. So that's a good example of thinking ahead of the airplane. I do want to note that the amount of thinking ahead required varies by aircraft speed. So you're going to think ahead a lot further in a 737 versus a Piper Warrior, just because you're moving faster and things are happening that much more quicker. So far we know how to excel as a team and stay strategically organized when we're flying around mentally, but what about physically? So Benjamin Franklin actually has one of my favorite quotes that says, for every minute spent organizing is an hour earned. So keeping the cockpit organized in a physical sense is like having the needed materials and information that you're going to need for the flight ahead already available. Having adequate knowledge about the aircraft, the airport, and the airspace you're going to be flying through. Also, another item is the proper mindset before you even leave the gate. Having that winning attitude, that winning mindset of you're going to conquer the flight, think ahead, and you're ready to handle and tackle anything that comes across your flight deck. Here's some top tools for your toolbox that I recommend that you use to keep physical organization in the cockpit. So Sebastian actually stole my talking point here, but a notepad is one of the biggest tools that we use in every day of flying. So when you go back to your hotel room, steal all these that you can, because they're the greatest things to use on your flight deck. You can use them at home. Also, I think some of the vendors out there are giving out free swag, which some were notepads, so go steal all those if you can. They're great for jotting things like clearances down, complex ATC instructions, anything you're going to have to remember basically in the flight. Also a good place to write your flight number, which I always forget, or your gate that you're going to be arriving at, and any ATIS information, so you don't have to go back and keep trying to pull it up. You can just have it right there in front of you. Show of hands though, how many married people are in a serious relationship do I have? How many of y'all? Oh man, I'm sorry. So those of you raising your hand may be absolutely great or absolutely terrible with this next item. Listening. So a key thing with listening while flying professionally and in your simulators at home that you can do is keeping an active auditory awareness of what's going on around you. That includes things inside and outside the cockpit. So a good example of that is listening to your co-pilot or your significant other, I guess in some of your cases. Listening to air traffic control is another good one. And also while you're listening, trying to paint a mental picture of what is going on around you. It's another great way of maintaining organization within the cockpit. Also located nearby your ears that we use is the brain and common sense. As mentioned earlier, this is probably one of the biggest tools that pilots use on a day-to-day basis that you can use at home in your simulators. Processing things in the present while thinking ahead is a great use of your brain. Also, being knowledgeable about the aircraft, the airspace, and any of that information before you fly around is great. Common sense is a big thing that it seems like becomes really tough when you're operating an aircraft. The key thing to remember here is if something doesn't make sense, speak up or ask the question, what is going on, and try to get to the bottom of it. Complacency is not welcome in aviation, and using your common sense and trying to speak up if you don't understand something is numero uno and priority. One of the final items that greatly contribute to cockpit organization on the physical spectrum includes charts. So this gentleman over here talked about having access to all these charts before his flight even starts. Perfect. That's fine. You don't have to have them in a physical sense available, but as long as you have access and readily access available to them or any other charts that you'll need, that's really what we're looking for here. Also, a release or any sort of flight planning is a great tool to have right in front of you so you don't have to go dig for information or anything like that, and you can focus on flying the airplane. Now that we have these organizational tools, let's talk about putting our organized flight deck that we now have into action. So now we're going to progress into briefings and what exact roles they play in our day-to-day operations. Briefings are not only useful in multi-crew operations, but also single pilot. So each of you that fly at home are probably flying in a single pilot operation. These still will benefit you. The key, though, is to keep them brief and informative, hence the name briefing. So briefings are typically done with a focus on things that typically occur, or flight items that occur in the critical area of flight, so below 10,000 feet, basically. This study actually took accidents and fatality reports from 2008 to 2017 and compiled them into what phase of flight they occurred in. So does anyone notice where a majority of these accidents and incidents occurred? Your critical phases of flight, so below 10,000 feet. Notice that a majority of those accidents make up those areas. Given these alarming statistics, how exactly do these briefings help benefit us in these phases of flight? So briefings are going to help us paint a picture of what to expect. It's important to remember, though, that expecting something and having that expectation end up hurting you can actually be a double-edged sword. So avoiding something of what we call in the aviation industry called expectation bias. That's essentially you've done something the same way 1,000 times, and that one time that it needs to be done differently, you still do it that same way you've always expected it to be done. So we want to avoid that at all costs. If you get a last-second change in things like a departure runway or an arrival or a departure or an approach from ATC or anything like that, it's critical to remember that we can take the time to adjust for those changes, and that's what we want to do. That's what we do as professional pilots, and you can do that at home in your simulator. For example, if they change your departure runway on your taxi out, If you need the time, especially if you're single pilot, ask to pull over somewhere so you can make the changes that you need to do, and then you can rebrief the changes to make sure you're familiar with the new updates, and then you can continue taxiing and do that new departure runway that you're going to use. These briefings typically occur at different points during flight. So what we call those are triggers. So essentially a trigger will launch a briefing of that phase of flight. The content location of each briefing is going to vary by airline or operation, but in today's example, we're just going to be using my airline and what we do. So our departure briefing is typically triggered by a clearance received and when we have our fuel on board. There's quite a few items that we kind of touch on during a briefing, and I know it looks like a lot. I'll actually have a link to my presentation at the end that I'll provide y'all, so you can go back and actually really hone in on what these specific highlight points are. So there's departure brief, taxi review after receiving our outbound taxi clearance. That's when we're going to get that. This one's really easy though. We're usually doing this on the fly. So we'll review any taxiway routing assignments that we'll have, any assigned runway crossings or hold short instructions. So we want to avoid all those runway incursions, which is what we call them in the aviation world. And are we going through any hot spots? If so, we probably want to talk about them and figure out what's going on there. They're hot for a reason. Takeoff briefing is typically done after a runway assignment has been received and we have both engines running. There's nothing like trying to take off with one engine. Believe it or not, it's actually happened in real life. Approach briefings are typically done 100 nautical miles to 200 nautical miles from the airport. Just depends on the situation, but typically we want to knock these out before we hit our top of descent. I know there's a lot of items here, but believe it or not, most of these items are covered in your arrival plates, your approach plates, and your airport diagrams. So it's just like reading them top to bottom, left to right. You're going to hit most of these points anyways. So now let's go ahead and blast off. We're going to do our example flight, flying here to FS Expo here in Orlando. Going to be leaving DFW and coming in MCO. We're departing on the Triton 3 and arriving on the Piglet 6 arrival. So essentially, I'm going to just try to keep these brief and walk you through kind of what they sound like for us, and we'll go from there. All right. This may be a little hard to see because the Jeppesen charts just aren't very crystal clear on their lettering and stuff. But essentially, this is what a departure brief would sound like. All right, so it's going to be my leg. Looks like we're departing 17 right. And we've got the assigned squawk loaded in of 0566. I double-checked the routing in the FMC. It cross-checks with the clearance that we received from ATC, so we're good to go there. No surprises. Next, we're going to be departing 17 right, and it looks like we'll be RNAV off the runway, or first fix is Spera. I've double-checked that in the FMS as well at this point. There is a note there I want to cover, and that's the J-Girl intersection down there. It's limited to 240 knots, and we got to cross it at or above 5,000. So let's just keep in mind that that comes pretty quick, and we want to make sure that we're doing that. Looks like there's a high obstacle on our departure route, but shouldn't really be a factor. It's only 1,300 feet. We're going to be climbing via the SID per our clearance, and our top altitude's 10,000 feet. At this point, I'm also pointing at the altitude selector window and ensuring we've got 10,000 dialed in there as well. So pointing and talking at the same time is a really good rule of thumb to use and a good habit to get into, even in the simulator world. And our engine out procedure, it looks like it's a special one. It's just a left turn heading 150, and if we do lose it, looks like we're coming right back to DFW. There's plenty of long runways, good firefighting services available there. So we'll come back and give them our business and go home. So next is our taxi and takeoff briefing. So taxi, we just got assigned our taxiway instructions to 17 right, and you can see the airplane. We're still sitting there at the gate down there by the E-terminal. What we're covering in our taxi briefing is essentially the bottom right items I've gotten there. So looks like they gave us a simple taxi route that we expected, Kilo Echo Golf to 17 right, straight shot. I'm not seeing any hot spots on the chart. Typically, we'd ask our partner or the other co-pilot that we're flying with, do you see anything or do you have any questions? And if not, then we run our taxi checklist. So now we've been taxiing the runway, we've lit both engines, and we're ready to do our departure briefing. Departure briefing is basically a simplified version of our original brief. Sorry, our takeoff briefing is a simplified version of our departure briefing. So we're just hitting on the highlight areas. All right, so this is what it'll sound like. All right, so for our takeoff briefing, it's runway 17 right. Double check that in the box. We'll be LNAV off the runway. First fix is Spera. Once again, I'm cross-checking that. And it looks like we're going to be climbing out on VNAV, top altitude 10,000, and just reviewing our engine out procedure since it's different from normal. It's a left turn heading 150. Any questions? No questions. Cool. Now we run our before takeoff check. And once that's complete, you want to make sure that that takeoff briefing is done before you enter the runway. A big thing of avoiding runway incursions is making sure that you're focused on where you're going and you're not inside or distracted or anything when you're crossing a runway or when you're on a runway. So try to get in that habit. Now we're in the arrival briefing stage. So at this point, we're about 200 miles from the airport, and I've cross-checked all the altitudes and restrictions in the box. If you guys notice, there's a lot of expect altitudes on the Piglet arrival. What we do is we dial in those altitudes anyways because an expect is not a compulsory crossing unless it's assigned by ATC. However, it's good to get in the habit of putting those in anyways because you want accurate top of descent information and you want accurate fuel information for your arrival airport. We call that a FOD, or fuel over destination. So it looks like we loaded everything up in the box correctly. I've got all of our expects. I've cross-checked those. We're expecting runway 17 right. I'm just going to quickly brief this approach. We've got 21-3 ILS 18 right. It's effective 6th of October effective 12th of October. The localizer 11-9, we've got it set on both sides. Final approach course 185. Our glide slope intercept at Tuffy's 2200 with a DA of 294. Typically, we round up to the nearest 10 on dialing in our minimums on the airplane. So we've got it set to 300, and that's set on both sides. So we're looking and making sure we've got that set. Touching down 94 feet, MSA around the airport, off the Orlando VOR, 3,000 feet. So if we do get lost or confused or anything like that, that's going to be a safe altitude to be at in the area. Simultaneous approaches are going to be in use with the other runway. And it looks like the VGSI and descent glide path are not coincident. That's a big note that you're going to see on a lot of your plates. So if any of you have noticed in the simulator, your PAPI may not necessarily be in agreement with your glide slope indication. That's what they mean by that. Looks like we'll get vectors in from the northwest there, so probably a base vector and a turn to final, so no biggie. It's a Mauser line system with the PAPI on the left-hand side. Missed approach, straight ahead to 500, right climbing turn 4,000 on 270 heading. And it looks like we'll intercept the 227 radial to Canby and a hold is depicted. I'm also cross-checking this in all the boxes I'm saying it. Our minimums down there for visibility, 1,800 or RVR or a half mile. And right now the airport, we'll take a look at the weather before all this. The airport's reporting 10 miles, so we're good to go on that, just if we need it. On the landing, it looks like it'll be a left-hand turnoff. We'll cross 18 left, so let's make sure we're clear to cross. And we're going up to airside 3 up there, so it should be a quick taxi in, and there's no ramp control in effect or anything like that, so we should be good to go straight in. No hot spots or anything on the way in expected. So notice, those were all pretty quick, brief, to the point, and that's it. That's all your briefings have to do, and it's just a reiteration of the key points that you really should be covering. So automation management. What the heck is actually going on with these amazing aircraft that we fly, these super complex, technologically futuristic aircraft that we're flying? We see this problem a lot where a lot of simmers just don't understand how automation really works. Well, automation enhances safety, improves our operation effectiveness and capabilities and efficiencies. We also helps us reduce workload as a flight crew. So make sure you use automation to your advantage. I highly encourage simmers to get to know their aircraft before they actually climb in. So get to know that automation and how it works. I hear things a lot of times where I don't know what it's doing or my FNC told me to do this. That's never going to be an acceptable answer. I'm sorry. Remember that ultimately you are the people flying. So you are the captain now. Managing automation and understanding is also just part of the job. So take pride in your hobby and actually learn how that automation works. Just remember, though, that automation lives and breathes in a simple world. So it works in a vertical lateral guidance, active armed, fast or slow speed world. And these modes can all work independently or together. So it simply lives in a ones and zeros, true and false world. It's not as complicated as a woman, I promise. So now that we have all these forms of automation, it sounds pretty simple, right? Ones and zeros, trues and false. But it actually works in 3 different levels. So basic, moderate, and advanced. The key of flying, though, is to remember which modes can we use in each of these tiers to actively use the best mode available to us for the phase of flight. Quick example of these, a basic one is lateral, is a heading mode. Vertical is vertical speed or FPA mode, depending on the aircraft. Moderate's lateral mode is VOR or localizer tracking. A little bit more advanced, but nothing too crazy. Vertical's indicated airspeed hold or flight level change mode. Our advanced levels are GPS and LNAV, and our vertical would be VNAV or approach, so really complex stuff. How do we know which level of automation to use? Use what makes sense to you. If you're really behind the aircraft and you can't take advantage of the programming that you did on the ground in the air, go to a heading mode. Keep it simple, don't work too hard. If you're already in cruise, it's probably more appropriate to use something like LNAV and VNAV because you take advantage of all that programming and work you did on the ground. Yeah. Skip ahead here. Like I mentioned, though, the key is consistency. So we want to make sure we're doing things the same way, the right way every single time. That's going to keep you out of trouble. And the key thing to remember in aviation is consistency is king. So take that home with you to your simulators. All right, so key takeaways from this is remember that multi-crew responsibilities can help you and they can hurt you. Just make sure that you're using them right. Have a consistent game plan for each flight. Also try to stay ahead of your aircraft and get familiar with your aircraft before you go up and fly it. There's a procedure called CAMI, which unfortunately I kind of ran out of time to explain, but it goes along the lines of confirm, activate, monitor, and intervene. So every input that you input to your airplane, you want to follow those steps. And if you look at my slideshow, with the link I'm going to provide you here in a second, you can review that, and I've got an example of that here in the presentation. Also, ask questions and continue to strive to be a better pilot every single flight. Take something away from each flight, and remember, like Jason Shapert says, a good pilot is always learning. And remember, you are the captain, you're in charge of the airplane, so fly it. All right, thanks guys, and if you have any questions, I'll be out back since we're out of time, and have a great weekend and enjoy the rest of Expo.